information about corruption on the likelihood that respondents will vote for a candidate or a party. And then if we, within the experimental field, focus on field experiments, again, there the literature is a little bit mixed, and the impact of randomized interventions that provide corruption information is weak, right? And so our proposal here is how to bring all of these different findings together. And we think that information self-selection and the process of exposing oneself to information can explain part of why corruption is not punished at the ballot box, and why we might find these different results in the lab versus in the real world. And so what we're trying to do with this paper is to try to analyze the impact of corruption on voting behavior once we account for this process of information self-selection. Information is key for corruption to be punished at the ballot box, right? Voters need to know about corruption. And there are two stages at which the role of information is important. First, individuals have to receive that information. You have to be exposed to information about corruption, and you have to receive that information. But then as a second step, you also need to accept that information and to update your preferences, your attitudes based on this information that you receive. And so we're asking whether citizens are willing to be exposed to this kind of information, right? This first step or this first stage in the causal chain linking corruption to punishing a corrupt politician at the ballot box. And then as a second step, those who are exposed to this information, are they persuaded by it? And we argue that we have to jointly account for these two phenomena, for these two stages at the same time. Why? Because some individuals will select in and out of corruption information, but also because we think that those who select in and out differ in how persuadable they are, in how they respond to this information about corruption. And to be able to address this, we implement a preference incorporating choice and assignment design, PICA design, which we fielded online in Spain in 2021. And I will give you a little bit more details later. But first, let's go back a little bit to the theory and why we expect these differences. As I was saying earlier, these two stages are key for corruption to be punished at the ballot box. But we know that when respondents get information about corruption, particularly if it's from their preferred party, this generates some cognitive dissonance, right? We don't want to hear about the bad performance of a party or a candidate we like. And so individuals might engage in different strategies to reduce this cognitive dissonance that is generated by being exposed to this information. The first step is, as I was saying, the first stage of selective exposure. So just avoid being exposed to that information. And we know that people do that, and we know that political predispositions are linked to that process of selecting in and out of information, right? We know that different types of political predispositions like knowledge, information, affect how individuals access political information and how they select the information that aligns with their pre-existing beliefs. But they can also be exposed to that information, right? But then engage in motivated information processing, right? So for instance, read or watch a piece of news about corruption from their own party, but then engage in motivated reasoning, and so not process this information even-handedly, but update one's attitudes in line with the pre-existing attitudes and predispositions. And I think, or we think that what's interesting here is that some of the factors that we expect to moderate this process of information motivated reasoning are in many cases related to that same process of whether one chooses or not to be exposed to that information, right? We suspect that there might be some individual characteristics that could be driving these two processes. And so we want to look at how this, so to take into account, right, how the process that drives information selection can also affect the process of motivated information processing. And this will all become clear, I think, also when I show you a little bit of the research design. Because what we have to do if we want to bring these two stages together is first, we have to know who selects in and out of this type of information about corruption. And then in a second step, we have to understand how these characteristics, or how the individuals who have different sets of observable and unobservable characteristics, update their preferences based on this information that they are exposed to. And so to do this, as I was saying, we need to observe these two parts, right? How do we do this? In a traditional randomized controlled trial, right, we just assign individuals randomly to one treatment. Someone reads about, you read about corruption, you read about something else, there's a random assignment. But we know that in real life, citizens have some margin to choose what kind of information they're exposed to and what kind of information they consume. They can choose to consume or to be exposed to pro-attitudinal information, to counter-attitudinal information. And here we also include another type of information, which is non-political in kind, right? Because particularly we're interested in the setting of corruption. And as I was saying earlier, these treatment effects, attitudinal updating, might depend on the characteristics that is underlying this process of choice. And we are able to do this to study these two stages of reception and acceptance with this PICA design, which we fielded online on a sample of online survey respondents, about 3,000 respondents in Spain with quotas for gender, age, education, and regions. So what does this design look like? And I think then all becomes a little bit clearer. So first of all, before I go into the graph, we define pro-attitudinal, counter-attitudinal information based on individuals' partisanship, right? So we consider pro-attitudinal information that is positive about one's preferred party, and as counter-attitudinal, which is negative, corruption with respect to one's preferred party. So how this design works is that first, we have to measure individuals' partisanship, the party that they like better. And based on that, we first measure stated preferences in terms of information consumption. That is, we show respondents 6 different headlines. One that is about corruption from their preferred party. The prosecutor's office accuses the party of irregular financing. Another one that talks about the good performance of their preferred party, how it reduced the debt in the municipalities where that party is governing. And then we add 3 other options which have also a politics content, but it's not related to any party in particular, so it's not clearly pro or counter-attitudinal. And then 2 items that allow respondents to not have to read about politics at all, right? About happiness and recipes and dishes on Instagram. And so what we first do is to measure this stated preference, right? In the real world, what kind of information would these people consume? Which headline would they choose out of this selection? Then individuals go through a process that is called the washout period. So here they're asked all our set of pre-treatment covariates that we then introduce in the analysis. And then the PICA design has 2 stages of randomization. In a first stage, the sample, the respondents are distributed into 2 different groups. One group goes to a traditional randomized control trial. So one group, this at the top, goes to a forced exposure condition where they're assigned to read a news article randomly. So each respondent reads by random assignment, either about corruption from their own party, about good performance of their own party, about entertainment or other political information. So that is a typical randomized control trial, nothing new here. But then we also have a free choice condition or a free choice arm where participants can select the news they want to read and then they read that. So this arm resembles, right, the real world in a sense. And then at the end of the survey, we measure outcomes, which in this case, we're focusing on the probability to vote for one's preferred party. So that same party on which they saw the news about corruption, good performance, or vote intention for that same party with next Sunday, if elections were held next Sunday. If at some point there are any clarification questions about the designing or anything, I'm happy to respond. But so what do we see? What are our results? So I think the first interesting piece of information is really to try to see how many people would actually choose to read about corruption if we don't assign this randomly, but we tell them which of these headlines would you like to read. And this already is showing us, right, to a certain extent, why corruption or the punishment of corruption might be mild in the real world, right? We find that very few people, only 15% of the sample, want to read about corruption, an article about corruption from their own party. A large majority just wants to read about the good performance of their own party, And then a third of the sample wants to read one of the entertainment news about the dishes on Instagram and happiness, right? So this is already telling us that this could be part of the reason why in the real world, the punishment of corruption is lower than when we randomly assign individuals to read about corruption. We can also see how these people differ, right? The ones who choose these different types of information. So here in gray, you have all of the people who choose to read about entertainment, and each of these bars shows the deviation from the sample average. And so we see, as we would have expected, that those who avoid political information typically have lower levels of political sophistication, right? Lower political interest, lower political knowledge. And they also have a lower strength of party identification. They also have lower levels of education. We do not find any interesting differences by gender or age. And we look at other covariates, but now I mean, I think those are the most important ones. And then, as we would also expect, no, the political information is related to higher levels of sophistication. Those who want to read about the good performance of their own party have a stronger party identity. And here we had a couple of questions that asked to what extent respondents were willing to read challenging information, or to what extent they liked to be challenged in arguments and discussions. So as a way to try to see whether there's kind of like an open-mindedness that would explain why among the politically interested, mostly, no, some would like to read about corruption information from their own party. And we see that there is like a slight difference on this. We also asked whether corruption is the most important problem for them, but we also do not see, because we suspected that maybe people who care more about corruption then are also more likely to consume this information. But we don't really see big differences here. So few people would like to read about corruption. Many people want to read about the good performance of their own party. Quite a substantial amount want to read about entertainment, and the correlates in terms of political sophistication, I would say, are what we would have expected. So what does the punishment of corruption look like when we have kind of this randomized control trial versus the real world setting? So in this table, I'm always showing you the results by PTV and voting intention. I will just comment the ones on PTV. You can always see the other ones on the side. The results are very consistent across the two outcome variables. So if you focus on this first column, here you have your typical results from a your results from a typical randomized control trial. The reference group here are those who read about entertainment, and we find that those who are randomly assigned to corruption have lower propensity to vote for their preferred party after reading about corruption. Yes?
Just a quick clarifying question.
Yeah.
That's a binary outcome measure? So
this is a 0 to 10 scale, so it's the 11-point scale. It's half a point on the scale. Yeah. And so this, right, all of these first rows are the random assignment groups. And then what we have here in this third column is a comparison, right, to the real world in a sense. So those who go into the free choice arm, their likelihood of voting for their preferred party is not different from those who read the entertainment news, right? So this shows us that there is not a lot of punishment of corruption in this arm, right? Part of this could be related to the fact that, as you saw in the first results earlier, many people do not read about corruption, so no wonder that their PTV doesn't respond if they don't read about that. But then the other phenomenon that could explain this difference, right, could be maybe even those who read about corruption update their attitudes to different extents than those who don't choose to read about corruption. And this is what I'm going to show you next. So what are the differences in the treatment effect by preferred information? Here you see the randomized control trial only. So this is only information from the top arm. And what we see here is the treatment effect of this random assignment to read about corruption based on one's preferences. And what we see here is that reading about corruption only decreases the propensity to vote for one's preferred party among those who prefer to read the entertainment news. That is the only group which updates their preferences when they're randomly assigned to read about corruption. All the other groups, the groups who said, well, I would have read about the good performance of a party, but I'm assigned to the corruption treatment in the randomized arm. For them, having read about corruption from their own party doesn't really affect their likelihood of supporting their own party. The same for those who prefer to read about corruption. So there's those who choose to read about corruption. When they're forced to see this in the randomized control trial, they don't really update their preferences either, right? And for the politics neutral, we do not see an effect either, although as you saw, this is a smaller group, right? Those who declare they would like to read that news about Trump and the G7. And there's a second set of results that goes in the same direction. Here we compare, or we use this, or we see this as a test to compare kind of the real world to what would happen if we treated people with information about corruption, right? So in the black coefficients here show the predicted levels of PTV, of propensity to vote for one's preferred party in the free choice condition, right? So for those who do whatever they want to do in the free choice arm. And we see, for instance, that those who prefer to read about entertainment, their propensity to vote for their preferred party is 7.3 for all of those who are in the free choice arm. But what would happen what would be the PTV for this group if, instead of going through the free choice, through the real world arm, they went through the forced exposure condition? We would see that when they are randomly treated with information about corruption, these people who have these preferences have lower levels of support for their own party. But again, this is the only case, right, where we see a decrease, a punishment of corruption. For the other three groups, based on stated preferences, there's no difference in the likelihood to support one's preferred party for those who are exposed to read about corruption. Yes. Yes.
Free choice, irrespective of what they choose.
Irrespective of what they choose to read. Yes. We assume let's say the compliance rate is very high. So we ask people what they would like to read. No, then they go through all of this washout period. That we even have a couple of days of washout period for some respondents, and then they choose and they read. And I think it's like, now I don't have this number in my head, but I think it's about like 96% match between what they declare and what they do afterwards. So there could be some people who first say that they want to read about corruption, and then when they have to read, they choose something else. But yes, so this is pulling them all together, irrespective of what they read. Everyone who said they would prefer to read about entertainment, and then they could read whatever they wanted, their PTV for their preferred party is 7.3, and those with the same preferences, but that went through the forced exposure condition and were forced to read about corruption, the propensity to vote for their preferred party is lower. And so, yes, so this is a way to try to compare, okay, so what happens in the real world versus if we force these people to consume information about corruption based on their preferences. So what do we conclude from these results? Well, first, one of the findings is that this selective exposure, right, could explain why we see a limited punishment of corruption, right? And why we also find this mismatch between the randomized control trials, the survey experiments, and punishment of corruption in the real world, right? Because when we compare what happens in our randomization setup, in our experimental setup versus what happens in the free choice condition, we see that there is hardly any punishment for corruption when individuals can read whatever they want, right? When they can base the information based on their existing preferences. Partisans, the politically sophisticated and also those with higher levels of party identity, tend to select out from counter-attitudinal information, and they also unlikely to be persuaded by this information, even if we show them that, right? So there is not a lot of potential to increase corruption accountability by this group of politically interested people, right? Because we saw that political interest and knowledge is related to a higher likelihood to read about the good performance of one's own party. And then the people who choose to read about the good performance of one's own party, they really do not update their preferences if we expose them to information about corruption. What we see as the share of the population that could allow for corruption to be punished at the ballot box would be among these inadvertent or uninterested citizens, right, who might not opt for this kind of information in the first place, right? They prefer to read about Instagram dishes or about something else, but when they're exposed to it are the ones who change their attitudes most, right? So we think that the potential to increase corruption accountability is really through this quite a large group also of inadvertent or less politically interested people. And that's everything from my side. Thank you very much, and looking forward to
Yeah, thank you very much for the great talk. We have plenty of time for questions, so we're going to open up the floor now, and I'm also been monitoring the chat, so feel free to type in any questions that you might have. Yes.
Cool. Thank you for this really cool, interesting presentation. I really like the design and how you've done it, so I just want to say very neat. My name is Haley, by the way. I have many questions, so I will just pick one and maybe ask you later because I find this a really interesting study. One thing that I was wondering is about, like, I was thinking if the people that are kind of choosing to read these articles, like the more political sort of articles rather than the entertainment one, you're not seeing effects there. Like, I wonder how much news media they consume already and how frequently they're exposed to political scandal that they kind of, I mean, immediately have a kind of counter argument in their head. Like, I know that you talk about motivated reasoning and whatnot, but I guess my point is I wonder if you're also looking at controlling for the more broader news consumption patterns. Like, I don't think this is a thing, but like corruption fatigue or something, or political scandal, I don't care anymore because it's, do you know what I mean? Yeah, so I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
yeah. Just the dynamic is okay. Yes, no, I just wasn't sure. Yes, I mean, the thing, right, is that we have also some information about media consumption and exposure to information. Obviously, this is also highly correlated, right, with this group. So it's not, we cannot really see, well, you know, can we control for that? Because it's very much related to the question of whether one wants to read about corruption or not. Yes, I mean, this could also be, that could be some of the kind of like unobservable factors, right, that might explain why this treatment effect is different between the two groups, right? And we suspect that there are other, probably unobservable characteristics that could explain some of this. But in a sense, I think this, again, kind of like brings attention to the fact that there is this, that if corruption accountability is to increase, right, it then goes through this group of voters who are less interested or who do not consume so much political information. I think something that we are also a little bit surprised about is that we would have expected to find a positive effect of the good performance treatment on which we didn't find. So this, I think, is also, so, I mean, that could go in the direction of saying, well, these people already have made up their minds about politics and already consume a lot of information. And so reading this additional news that we showed them in the experiment doesn't really alter attitudes that much, because as you were saying, you're like the marginal no effect of like reading this piece of information when you're already consuming a lot of political information. So that could be part. I mean, we can acknowledge that. I don't think there's much that we can do about that, just because this is so highly correlated that we don't have enough common support in the sample to estimate this for like groups of people who read about the good performance of their own parties, but don't consume information, because that's quite highly correlated. But we can definitely look into that.
Yeah, I think the next question is there.
Yeah, Macarena, really great presentation and interesting research. So thank you. My question builds a bit on Haley's question, because you started saying, okay, it's really a two-stage process. It starts with being exposed to certain information and then processing the information, but also believing the information. And I was wondering, because I didn't see that in the rest of the presentation, do you have data on whether people actually believe the story that they read on whether on corruption within their own party, or the more glorifying information that people are given about, and whether people believe that? Do you have any information?
We have information about, we asked them how serious, we asked them about how serious they think corruption is in Spain. Because, yeah, so it's not that specific about the credibility of the information. I don't think we have a question. I mean, we could look at the time they spend reading the news, but then I would also wouldn't know in what direction this would go. Could go both ways. And we asked them about the seriousness of the corruption in Spain, and we don't find the difference there in terms of whether the impact of reading about corruption on these perceptions of seriousness of corruption doesn't seem to differ by stated preferences. So it doesn't seem like those who read the entertainment think that corruption is a very serious problem in Spain. But the problem we have there is that you can already guess how this is distributed in Spain. So many respondents think that corruption is a serious problem in Spain. So it's hard to, but we don't know. I don't think we don't have a measure of the credibility of the news. We have manipulation checks. So we asked them about some factual information that was included in the different news. So I guess we could look into that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of also of this process of motivated reasoning, right? To just say like, no, this information is not lending credibility to that information.
More on the actual causal mechanism that's going on there, because there could be so many different things that move in different directions. So if I'm a social democratic voter in Spain, and I read about corruption among the social democrats, I would be inclined to think, yeah, but the Partido Popular
is worse. Yeah.
So it's not going to affect my vote choice that much. And the Partido Popular is probably much worse. There's a lot of
yeah, well, it's interesting to see in that sense that we do not find differences in the treatment effects by one's preferred party. So we also stratify these results by we can only look at Partido Popular and PSOE because we don't have enough observations for the other smaller parties. But because also at some point we thought, well, maybe the effects are stronger for, again there, no, for the Partido Popular, but there are no differences in effects between the voters of the different parties. So I think also what we are doing here, I mean, we can see to what extent we can look into some of these mechanisms. I have to go again back to, because we have a lot of questions in the surveys, and I also don't remember anymore all of the questions we included. But yeah, so our interest here was really to try to look at these differences between the different groups, right? Versus based on preferences on information, and not so much on like the causal mechanisms about how people engage in motivated reasoning, because I think that would be a slightly, that's still interesting, but I think that would be a different question. And I think there's also quite some research that has looked into that, right? So how people evaluate the seriousness of the cases or the credibility of information differently based on whether this information is shown about their preferred party or another party, whether it comes from a more neutral source or a more partisan source. So here we were really interested in looking at these groups, and also to account, so to be able to, we can do analysis by partisanship, right? And we can manipulate that, and we can have experiments based on partisanship. But what we really wanted to do here is to get at these groups with different preferences, acknowledging that there are some observable factors that we can ask in a survey and that we can identify and see how this operates differently, but also to acknowledge that there are also some unobservable factors that drive this process, that motivated reasoning, that we capture indirectly through these preferences.
I think then we can move on to the next question over here, and then Rochelle.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I think this is really cool work, and I think you're hitting one of the mechanisms right on the head, so I think this is really valuable. I don't know if this is that well formulated of a question, but there's something I was wondering if you could help me think through a little bit, which is about the field experiments that are done on this, where people are forced to read the information, right? So like in the field design, you're only getting the first choice in the field experiments too, and there we're not seeing punishment either, right? And so I'm kind of trying to think through this mechanism in the context of field experiments, and I'm wondering, do you think maybe something that could be going on is that non-compliers in a field experimental setting are actually the ones who are selecting out seeing the treatment, or sort of ignoring it very quickly based on sort of the same mechanism that you're showing here? I'm just trying to think through that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I also think that's an interesting question, and I think in a next or in another, I don't know, in like a side, maybe there's a side paper coming out of this where we're also trying to see where we're looking at how some items, for instance, related to this question, right? So how do people process the information when they're in this forced exposure condition, right? In the lab, let's say, versus in the real world. And we do find some differences, for instance, in the average time that people spend reading the treatment, for instance, when the preference, when the condition matches their preferences, right? So this is already hinting at the idea that, maybe in a field experiment, if, that forced exposure already aligns with your predispositions, right, then maybe you get a stronger effect. So maybe depending on how the experiment is designed and the likelihood that you will even expose those whose predispositions don't align with the treatment you design can affect then the total effect.
Yeah,
but I think,
that's a good point, and maybe it even calls into question our measures of compliance in some of these field experiments, in the sense that, like, if I receive a flyer or have a read receipt on a text message, have I actually complied, or have I discounted the information immediately and discarded it without reading it because it's not in line with my motivated reasoning?
No, I think there is a lot to do in that, in trying to I think in this particular area of research, to bring together these different results, because it's a little bit puzzling that, it's a little bit puzzling that many of these survey experiments tend to find quite consistent evidence, of punishment, of corruption. But then as you move closer to the real world, then these effects start to fade out. And here we wanted to tackle this, but there are probably also a lot more mechanisms and moderators playing in this.
It's also interesting how easily you can manipulate the mechanisms, even in a survey experimental context.
In-
to reduce that punishment, right? Like you showed that
Yeah.
here, how, one particular mechanism can be done. So the survey experimental evidence also seems to be very sensitive, right?
Yeah.
Is there a clean alternative? Is
Yeah.
there a co-partisan? Is
Yeah.
there selective exposure?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Just have two very quick methodological questions.
Mhm.
So the first one, I'm not so sure if I just simply didn't catch it, but I was wondering if you had samples from multiple regions in Spain.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we have quotas by the 17 autonomous communities.
Okay. And the second one was just when you're letting people select what they're going to read, how do you prompt them? What do you tell them? Like just read whatever you like, or do you give them some?
You mean in the headline? So in the headline selection task, we show them like a set of 5 headlines, and we ask them if you could read one of these articles, which one would you read? And so also what we do is that we present them with different sets of headlines that they have to choose from. So they do several headline selection tasks. And then in the free exposure condition or selection condition, we ask them again. Now we tell them that they're going to have some time to read an article, and that they have these different options, and that they should choose the one that they would like to read. And so then they click on the headline, and then they go to the next screen, where I think I have some information here about how it looks like. And then they go to a screen where they read the different treatment, right? So this is what it looks like for a voter of the Partido Popular in Qualtrics. This is the corruption treatment. I don't know if I have the others. Yeah. So for instance, this is the one for, and so they are shown this screen. Yes, and then they read it. They have some time to read it, or they can spend as much time as they want reading it, and then they go through the rest of the survey.
Yes.
Thanks. I really like this paper. Just have two sort of methodological questions. So one is on these treatments. Are they real facts, or are they made up? And how do you do with the ethics of that?
They're not real, but they're based on real news. So we took some news about a similar case that happened in, I think it was in Valencia, at the local level, because it's about corruption in three municipalities in Spain, but that then were used to, so the corruption was in 3 municipalities, but it was for some general election campaigning in Spain, because we also wanted to have this go beyond just the local or the municipality level. And so they're all based on real, or they were inspired by a real article, but then obviously, I mean, we have to change the party, so it's not, then it's not real. And we have, we just tell them at the end of the survey that some of the information they saw wasn't real. And sorry, and we also tried to find, and we have some examples of this. So we had to find a way to write these articles and this text to make it credible for the different parties across Spain, because everyone saw their preferred party. So for Partido Popular, and so it is quite easy because there have been a lot of cases of corruption, so it's not completely crazy. But then for other parties like Podemos and some of the local parties like the Nationalist Basque Party, we tried to find there, we don't have cases like proved cases of corruption for all of these parties, but for all of these parties, there have been news where they were accused by someone of corruption, right? And so that's how we think it's still credible for most parties that, yeah, there could be something like this. Yeah.
I think since we're having so many questions, I would circle back to you and first.
I think it is really interesting. I have a more broad question, because when you think about what really happens in the natural environment, I was wondering if you really think that people select based on topic and would not go and buy their favorite newspaper and then start selecting like topic. Am I in a need for politics? So what I'm wondering is this design, do maybe people also choose to just read the entertainment because we know these websites online do not have anyway, so rather read about who's dating who instead of a political story where
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and we had so many discussions about how we should design this experiment from the beginning. We were like, how should we do it? Do we show what is pro-attitudinal and counter-attitudinal? Should we show? And then we decided for this because we thought it was clearer, right? But it's true that people can also avoid, information about corruption, or maybe they can avoid to read information about corruption in a certain light, right? So if the suspicions or the accusations of corruption are very public and very visible, I can still choose to read a different type of newspaper, right, that covers this in a different light than another paper, right? And there is quite a bit of media parallelism in Spain, so it's not so difficult for people to choose their source for the news based on their predispositions. I think that probably also plays a role, and we would have really liked to also include that here, but yeah, at some point it was it was just impossible to cover anything. But it's true that there are different ways in which people can selectively expose themselves to information about corruption. I mean, that, yeah. So this is what we chose in this case, and I think it's a clean design that allows us to identify really what is pro and counter attitudinal, because if we have like information about corruption from a trusted source or from a source that you do not trust, is this really pro or counter attitudinal? Because if it's about corruption from your preferred party, then it seems like counter attitudinal. But if it's from a newspaper that you like, then is this less or more counter attitudinal? It suddenly became really hard to then really identify. So that's why we decided to go for this clean. But I think that's a very fair point, and it would be actually I would really like to explore that further, right? So not just the types of news in this cleaner design, but also to try to play a bit more with what happens when you can choose not just to read about corruption or not, but to have different coverages of corruption. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I was wondering how much this argument of that corruption can also be seen as someone is corrupt, can be seen as a in-group champion.
Mm-hmm.
How does that argument play into this design?
I think in this case, especially particularly from the case of Spain, there are some studies that have found positive effects of corruption, right? So when corruption was happening at the same time as there was a good economic performance in the municipality, an increase in the what is it called, in the domestic product, in the GDP of the municipality, then actually corruption was beneficial. In this case, we designed a treatment, right, that doesn't include any positive effects of corruption, right? So there's no there's no more growth, economic growth or benefits to the municipality based on that. And yes, so I think, and the other thing is that we also do not find, because in that case, then maybe we would expect people who want to read about corruption to be more positively impacted by corruption. I don't know. But I think, I think this can play out, but I would think rather in other contexts, in these terms of saying, well, this brings some benefits to the municipality, for instance, brings more money to the region. But we try to define a treatment where it is clear that nobody's winning from. I mean, the only ones who are winning from this is the national party, right? So like the national organization of the party.
Another question? Oh, yeah. So Macarena, thanks. But maybe it's because it's Friday afternoon, but why I'm not familiar with this Pika design.
Mm-hmm.
I'm familiar with the forced and self-exposure line.
Mm-hmm.
So what's puzzling me is, why are you moving to conditional average treatment effect well, in fact, what you could estimate is the treatment effect among the forcefully treated compared to the treatment effect of the people who choose to be treated. I kind of asked you that question earlier, where you said it's almost one-on-one the same, but you're making it almost a quasi-experimental test by going for the pre-treatment conditioning. Well, you have the actual behavioral in the self-exposure arm. And I think what the work by, for instance, Finn Arsenault, friend of the lab, and Brian Gates suggests is that that is the clearer comparison for the argument you want to make. So I wonder, are you not
based on the actual, not based on stated preferences?
No, but the actual behavior. So what is the comparison of the treatment effect among people who are forcefully exposed to corruption compared to the people who choose to be? Because then I think you can make the argument you want to make is how much weaker does the treatment effect become? Now you're actually going back to, well, people who say they do this, they respond differently to the treatment. But I think you're adding a complexity that's not necessary. And so then the question is, what's the advantage of the PICA design compared to the more traditional forced exposure versus compared with the arm with self-selection?
Well, I think that what we wanted to do here, right, is to be able to differentiate this by stated preference, right? So in the forced exposure condition, we can only know what the treatment is for different types of preferences if we have asked them about preferences before, right? So that is, and this is, I think, this is something that we thought we would find like bigger effects at the beginning, but then we don't find so many in the end, right? So, I mean, what the idea behind this PICA design is that you can see both, right? So it's true that we can also include this comparison for this kind of like raw comparison between the forced exposure and the real world. But I think what's interesting about the PICA design is that it allows you to look at heterogeneity in treatment effects by stated preferences.
But your puzzle was more of how do, that was an earlier question. Your puzzle was more, it's like we see in the forced exposure experiments, we see a much bigger effect than in the real world. Where is that coming from?
Yes, and because we thought that it was a combination of the two, right? So we thought, okay, so why is this effect in the real world? And those are the two stages, right? One could be because people choose not to read this information, and so then it's just a matter of being exposed or not. But then the other part could be, well, because the effect of the treatment depends on whether or not you would like to be exposed to that information, right? And this is what we did with the second set of graphs. And we thought, I mean, our expectation was that we would also find bigger differences based on those who want to read, for instance, about good performance, but then are forced to read about corruption. But we only find this heterogeneity for the entertainment group. So that was the reason for the PICA design, right? To expect heterogeneous effects based on one's preferences that are driven by some observable factors like interest, partisanship, and so on and so forth, but also by maybe some unobservable factors that we cannot account for. And here we measure indirectly, right, through the choice. So I think that's the advantage at what we wanted to do with this. We don't see as much heterogeneity as we might have expected in the beginning, but that's the reason why we went for this design. Yeah, so that's why.
But I wouldn't.
Yes. Yeah.
They're going to be pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you an open question, which also builds on the things that have been asked before. So you started with the puzzle, right? With what you were also discussing right now. The puzzle is we have different findings for the survey experiments and for the real world, and you try with your design to move closer to the real world. But then, of course, it is the problem is that there is so much going on. So we have you have talked about the media diet, about whether it is believable what the messages say, which sources the messages come from, and also maybe people in real life can select more than just one article, right? So there's so much going on. So there's this whole research agenda. So my open question is, what is, according to you, the most important step to look at right now? Now you've found this, because there's so much, more you can do to move closer to the real.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that depends. It depends on what you're interested in, right? Me. Okay, okay. No, I thought, no, for me, I mean, for us, really, it's true that we set now this puzzle bigger than we could ever tackle, right? And anyone could, right? Because I mean,